Hello and welcome to this edition of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. My name is Tory Brown. I'm the designer of Votes for Women. Um, if you were hoping tonight to hear from Talia Rosen, the designer of First Monday, same. The design about the history of the Supreme Court is so interesting. The game is so beautiful, and Talia is so smart. But unfortunately, she is also so not here. She will be appearing in a future meeting, so you will have a chance to hear from her. And I think she'll be joined by the game's developer, Jason Matthews. So tonight it's just me. I hope that it's still interesting. This is also Votes for Women is also a historical game, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit about me, about the inspiration for my board game. Um, what's happening? All right. The process of design and the historical ties, sort of how what I learned about history while working through this game design and how it helps me think about what's happening today and like literally today. And we'll wrap it up. And I'm really interested to hear your questions, to talk about all of these topics and more. So let's jump in. As promised, tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Tory Brown, and I am the designer of Votes for Women. I studied government and women's studies in college at George Mason University here in the Washington, D.C. area. And since then, I have been a progressive activist. I have worked in labor unions, good government groups for the reproductive justice movement, and a range of issues that I really care about and that I hope will make material improvements to the conditions of people in this country. I am a big believer in the power of play, that it can educate, inspire, and mobilize people, and that it's just kind of fun. I like fun. I think oftentimes activists get kind of typecast as dour, as sort of, always warning about the worst and talking about the worst. But I think that there's a lot about play that and politics that can inspire and help us think about the kind of world we would like to live in. And I think history helps us understand how we got to where we are. As you can see, a few pictures splayed here, a book that my dad gave me when I was 10 years old, some women in my life, some marches that I helped plan. Certainly, I think anyone who cares about suffrage was probably inspired in some way by Winifred Banks from the movie Mary Poppins, and her activism for votes for women. And this quote here from Maya Angelou: "The truth is, none of us can be free until everybody is free," helps inspire me and think about the scope of my work and the reach of the kinds of changes that we hope to see in our country and in the world. So that's a little bit about me. I was inspired to create Votes for Women, both on the issues that I love, and I designed Votes for Women before the 100th anniversary of the suffrage centennial, the 100th anniversary of suffrage being signed in 1920. I have also got a chance to play a couple of games. One being I played lots of games, a lot of like Ticket to Ride and Carcassonne, sort of the new classics. But Watergate, which is by Matthias Kramer, is a two-player game where one side plays Nixon and the other side plays the Washington Post editors that were trying to hunt down the Watergate story. And Nixon is trying to cover up sources while the editors are trying to uncover them and connect pieces of evidence together. And the game is fun, it's fast, and it has a whole lot of historical information. So it was a huge inspiration. And Matthias Kramer does wonderful games. Watergate is just one of them. He is absolutely incredible. Another game that inspired me, and if you've played before, you might notice some similarities, is Jason Matthews, aforementioned, designer of 1960 Making of the President. And in that game, you are playing the campaign managers from the Kennedy and Nixon campaigns, and you play out over a map. You're trying to earn enough electoral votes in order to win the election. And it was another kind of like game, a map based game where historical events are either conspiring to help support or you're trying to strategize around all of these things that are happening, different tracks. And so that really helped mold in my mind what Votes for Women would look like. And it also really helped, honestly, in some ways of, there's some ahistorical elements to the gameplay of Votes for Women. And playing a game like 1960 helped me realize that that actually can be more fun rather than just sort of sticking to a textbook version of history. And so allowed me to have, I think, a little bit more creativity than I had originally allowed myself. The last piece that was important in my design story and creating and bringing Votes for Women to people's tables is Fort Circle Games, my publisher, and the head of Fort Circle Games is Kevin Bertram, who is my friend and has been my friend for a very long time. He published a game called Shores of Tripoli. You may have heard of it. He might have even appeared here before. Shores of Tripoli is about the birth of the Marine Corps in the United States and the fight against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. And after Kevin had finished work on Shores of Tripoli, he was asking all of our friends what we thought would be interesting games. I think he got a taste of publisher life and wanted to make it a career. And so I told him that he should really make a game on the suffrage movement. And he told me I should make a game on the suffrage movement. He was my developer. We worked through some sort of sticky design problems. It was a lot of fun to work together. But if not for Kevin, I would have never had the audacity to create a game about something that I'm as passionate about as I am about movement politics and about this era in our nation's history. So in true DC fashion, it's a little bit about what you know and a lot about who you know. And in this case, knowing a game publisher was really helpful. The mechanism, the theme of the game is about the ratification of a constitutional amendment. And in this way, it was really helpful for me to steal James Madison's design that he articulated in Article 5 of the Constitution, that in order for an amendment to be passed, a majority, or two-thirds of the House and Senate and three-quarters of states must ratify. And so, good artists borrow, great artists steal. When it came down to the design mechanism, it became clear that those two pieces, the congressional majority and then the state, three-quarters of states to ratify, would be a necessary factor and sort of eventually would become the victory conditions of the game. And the 19th Amendment itself, in case no one read it to you today, is the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. You might notice that this does not guarantee any rights. It only talks about rights not being denied. And this is an important piece because, as we know, the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment that was passed in 1920, did not open the floodgates to all people having equal franchise. It took years and decades, and in fact, we are still working to ensure that everyone has equal access to the ballot and an equal say and an equal voice in our political process. So the work continues, but this was an incredibly monumental step in ensuring that half of our nation's population wouldn't be denied their right to vote. I think an important thing about the 19th Amendment is just, in any constitutional amendment, is just how hard it is for any of them to pass, how unlikely constitutional amendments are. The last amendment to be added to the Constitution was in 1992, so it has been 30 some years since anything has been added to our Constitution, a very long time, especially in politics. And that amendment was originally proposed in 1789. That's the 27th Amendment that wasn't, it took 202 years to ratify. And that amendment is about the fact that Congress shouldn't be able to give themselves a pay raise during session, that any pay raise should take effect after the next election. In essence, if the people were so offended and so upset about the pay raise, they could vote all of the bums out, right? Since 1920, there have been a few voting rights oriented or on the topic of voting rights, amendments on the topic of voting rights added reducing the legal voting age to 18. In many states, it was 21 at that point. The abolition of poll taxes, although certainly with requirements we're seeing now, what constitutes a poll tax still sort of has some salience. And the District of Columbia was given votes in the Electoral College since 1920. Overall, is just to say that it is very difficult to amend the Constitution. Organizers of the 19th Amendment, some of them immediately went into working on the Equal Rights Amendment, and that had a time limit put on it, and that time limit was up in the 70s, and there's some legal disagreement about whether that matters. But what we do know is that there hasn't been an amendment added to the Constitution since 1992, which in my mind just makes it all the more remarkable what these women did to enact the suffrage amendment. And it gives us some thoughts about how difficult this kind of work is to do today. When the Supreme Court announced its Citizens United decision, really the only safeguard, the only check that the people have on the Supreme Court is a constitutional amendment. And we've seen, despite people being very unhappy with the role of money in politics, there hasn't been a credible amendment being mounted, even in the face of really unpopular issues. So, I think about, sometimes people are like, oh, well, we should just do a constitutional amendment. And I want to say, well, let me tell you what it took 70 years that it took for the 19th Amendment to be ratified, and how few have happened in the intervening years, and especially now this 1930, these now 35 years, or 33 years, how long it's been. So an important note on constitutional amendments and the historical lessons of the past that we take to our future. The heart of my game, the heart of Votes for Women, is about the people. It's not necessarily about the language, the Constitution, the ratification. It's about these many hardworking, dedicated people that were able to devote their lives and careers and all of their time to getting the amendment enacted. And my game is a card-driven game, and we'll go in through some of the process and what the game looks like and feels like and plays like. But these are images taken from the game and the cards in the game, and the people that drive the narrative. As you play Votes for Women, you're encountering these folks who have done this work, and it's really inspiring. And I take a lot of lessons from them, and we'll talk through some of those later on. But the heart of Votes for Women are really about the activists, the folks who did this work, because it took a lot of work, and their contributions to creating progress in society and opening space for more of us to have a role in our government is incredible. I want to pay respect to that. The message of the game is about today. It's about the movements that drive progress, and the best and most effective way that we as regular people have to ensure that we live in the kind of society that we want to live in. From voting rights demonstrations and labor struggles in the 60s, some of these protests about inequality, certainly the George Floyd protests and what we still sort of see going out today, and even protests and organizing on Georgetown's campus itself. Apologies. These are all important and incredibly inspiring movements where lots of people, for lots of different reasons, come together about a single issue. And I want folks who play Votes for Women to think about their role in movements, the kinds of organizations and clubs and activities and parties that they can join that will make a difference and will create the kind of neighborhood, city, state, and country that they want to live in. This ability for Americans to gather together to have their voice heard is one of our most fundamental rights. And I think it's also been one of the most effective that we've had in order to make positive change for a wide group of people. I want to talk just briefly about the moment that I was in when I was designing boats for women, and that was in the spring, summer, and fall of 2020. That certainly coincides with the COVID lockdowns. It was during the George Floyd protests and the uprising over police brutality and issues of racial inequality. For me, I designed Votes for Women while I was unemployed and newly sober. So I had a lot of time and energy, and I think it's been really hard now that I've gone back to working, really hard to devote the time and space to the kind of creative project like designing a game, all of the research, all of the play tests, all of the iterations. You know, other countries are able to support artistic endeavors in different ways. And I wonder if the United States was more like that, more able to provide some kind of universal basic income, the kind of creative pursuits, the kind of art, the kind of wonderful games that people would create. And, until something like that foments. I guess we just won't know. But certainly the context in which I was creating mattered a lot to me. And I think the context in which people are playing this game matters to them. It was released in the winter of 2022. Most people were able to access it in 2023. The Supreme Court decision striking down Roe versus Wade came down at that time. And certainly people wanted to talk to me about this game in the context of women losing rights in America. As the game sort of went through a different, we're now up to two printings. We went through the election, and the role of women in politics and in government was really important. And now we find ourselves in a time when rights are being threatened, and we're working very hard to defend the freedom of speech, the freedom of peaceful assembly. These moments, it mattered when I was designing, and it matters for players when they're playing. I took Votes for Women down to Richmond immediately after the election to play at a convention, and uh, and players brought their feelings about the election to the table. Right. This game in particular, but I think most games have a political analysis, and you can't strip one from the other. The moment and what's happening on the board weighs just like what's happening in their lives and on the news. And so I think it's important, if you think about designing a game, especially with the historical context and lessons for now, that you think about what people will be feeling and bringing to the table, because it's not just bits of cardboard and wooden meeples. It's a lot more than that. So the process for designing, besides getting sober and not having a job, was about this sort of brainstorming about what works. And to me, it starts with research. There's a huge historical record, primarily on the suffrage side. The game also includes the opposition, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, where just research was a lot more sparse. It took a lot more heavy lifting to find out the people, the motivations, the events on the anti-suffrage side. But certainly on the pro-suffrage side, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul. Hopefully, some of you have heard these names in your history classes or when you're forced to learn about women's history in the month of March. I started my research on Wikipedia, but it did not end there. It was really just sort of a place to look at what felt like were these really sort of key tentpole moments. And then my search connected, from 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, to 1920, when Tennessee was the final state to, or was the 36th state to ratify the amendment, and sort of how I was going to create a story or a narrative throughout those 70 years. And so Wikipedia gave me some nice tent poles, but I had to go further to find the texture and the interest in the stuff that wasn't just what was on the Wikipedia page. To that end, I went to the Library of Congress. The National Park Service has at least had remarkable information about the fight for equality and the struggle for women's rights. State historical societies were uploading a lot of their collections with money from the Centennial Foundation that Congress had set up to talk about what happened in their states. And as you'll see, the game plays out over a map. And so regionality was really important. And state historical societies were an important place to find who from Ohio, who from New Mexico, how do we create, these heroes in these different regions that then drive gameplay. Read a bunch of books. I keep reading books. It's one of these things where like I have now made suffrage sort of part of my personality. And so it's just something that I'll always be interested in. There's always just more to discover. Suffrage by Ellen Carroll Dubois is a really interesting story. It really tries to, I think, to take the widest snapshot possible. Recasting the Vote is a book about women of color in the suffrage movement. And so an important part of telling incredibly complex, in-depth stories that I didn't really learn about when I was in school, even in my women's studies classes. And then Ellen Weiss's The Women's Hour that talked about that last push in Tennessee for the final ratification, which informed the sort of final piece of the game design, which was the final voting that takes place, and we'll talk through that. So if you are interested in any of these subjects, you won't go wrong with any of these books. There's lots of public history content coming through. Again, we're celebrating 100 years of the 19th Amendment being in effect. And so the New York Times had a really great amount of coverage around that time. There's an exhibit in New Jersey about the fact that women in New Jersey had the right to vote from 1776 to 1807. There's often a bit of a debate about where did women vote first? Is it Utah or is it Wyoming? The real answer is New Jersey. And eventually they changed the state constitution that it removed land owning requirements, but put in gender, right? It used gendered language. All this stuff that you find out when you're doing this kind of research, and as in depth as I did. And the Senate was also the Senate archives were a really important piece because how the Senate was voting on the suffrage amendment was an important piece of measuring progress in society. And frankly, the Senate archives and the transcripts are really important to identifying some of the fiercest critics of suffrage, and the people that were most fiercely opposed were these senators that were voting down the 19th Amendment, or the Anthony Amendment as they called it then. And so that was also a really helpful place to go for research. And it turned into all of that, turned into these just enormous, unwieldy spreadsheets. And as you can see here, I mean, maybe the font is very tiny on your screen as well. I start by sort of like identifying some people, some places, some things that happened, events, the Civil War ending, that kind of a thing, and starting to categorize when this happened, what region was this happening in, what's some other information. I start collecting links to artwork that's available on the internet. And as I'm doing this research and sort of, putting out these sort of like row by row, and there's a tab for suffrage and a tab for opposition, it becomes clear before I have decided that I am designing a card-driven game. Watergate, which I really love, has cards and a deck that you play through together, and also 1960. And so maybe it was subconscious, but the amount of history that I wanted to include in the game, it became clear that the best way to do that was through dedicated decks for suffrage and for opposition. And I created a whole lot of entries and had to whittle them down. I had to say goodbye to some of my favorites. I had to, identify which interrupted the flow of the game, which sort of helped build momentum in the game. And so this is just sort of what it looked like in its rawest form, as I was still in a research and discovery phase before things started getting added to cards and appended with event text. And that gets us to Votes for Women, a card-driven board game published by Fort Circle and designed by yours truly, Tory Brown. As you can see here, these are what the cards look like. These are selected from the suffrage deck. They are delineated in early, middle, and late eras. So when you are setting up the game, you push, separate into piles the early, the middle, and the late decks. You shuffle all of those and then put it into one unified deck and work your way through as you go through. As you can see, there's artwork on every card. There's flavor text on every card, which was a little bit of a process of trying to write a history text via a text, right? About 160 characters was the limit for that space. And that creates the momentum for the game. And I think the board is next. We'll talk about the strategy first. As I mentioned, the game itself, one player or one side, there's lots of different ways that you can play the game. There's a solitaire, cooperative, and competitive version, so you can play 1 to 4 player. One side takes on the role of suffrage, and opposition takes on the role of opposition, which was really a fascinating piece. I learned the most from creating the opposition deck. This aspect of the game that felt very sort of normal to me, given that many war games, folks play the Confederacy or folks play Germany during World War II, as they say, right? Like I have been surprised how controversial of a decision it is to let folks take on the role of opposition. But what's a good game without a little, without a little controversy? The game takes place over 6 turns. Players are building power. They're pushing and pulling back and forth, up and down on a map, and we'll see that in just a second. Suffrage needs to convince Congress to pass and 36 states to ratify, while opposition wants to convince first Congress to reject, or if not, if they lose Congress, they only need 13 states to reject the 19th. And again, I stole this from James Madison. If you think that this sounds crazy, that suffrage needs 36 states and opposition only needs 13, yes, it's very hard to take that up with James Madison, please. Sometimes I wish it was easier to ratify or to amend the Constitution. And so players are asked to find the right balance between campaigning in the states and lobbying in DC. They have to manage limited resources, they have to make tough decisions, and they have to roll the dice, which in my career as a political strategist, I find myself doing quite a bit. This is what the board looks like. You'll see that there are 48 states. In 1920, Hawaii and Alaska had yet to be added to the Union. So that divides very evenly, thankfully, into 6 regions. Each region is composed of 8 states. And the game is played out on these states as suffrage is pushing to get majorities in 36 states, and opposition is trying to maintain a line of opposition in 13 states. At the bottom, underneath the congressional dome, you'll see our congressional tracker. There are these small white columns that represent progress in Congress, and those columns are coming in and out. See a turn tracker, and we also have a card track for cards with persistent effects. Things like constitutional amendments are in effect for the rest of the game. And if you know your history, the 15th Amendment created great big divisions in the suffrage movement. That was the amendment to give Black men, former slaves, the right to vote. People like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were vehemently opposed to a constitutional amendment that did not extend voting rights to everyone. They were a universal suffrage, or nothing, right? And suffragists like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass were making a case that a brick by brick, a step by step measure of building majorities that would be in favor of expanding democratic rights across the board would be really helpful. And so that will have effects in the game, just like it had effects in American history. So this is what the board looks like, and we are sort of creating majorities with small cubes. Well, first, some people don't like the board. They think that looks boring, the tan, but it's based on the tote bags that women would carry flyers as they went out to street corners, giving speeches, standing on soapboxes. The canvas board is a hat tip to the women whose names we have mostly forgotten, who were carrying these tote bags, doing the very hard work of what now is, I think, display ads and sponsored posts on your Facebook feed, that kind of thing. It used to take real people raising their voices in the public square to sort of get the message out. And so everything in this game has been what I would call themed to death, because every piece I had some time to think about how that looked. And so even if you think the canvas is ugly, I don't care because it means something to me. The cards we talked a little bit about. Every card has original artwork from the era. Sometimes it's the replication of a document, sometimes it's the cover of a book, sometimes it's a photo, like we see here. And again, we have some symbols on the card that give effects for gameplay, and then the flavor text that tells you why this card is in the game. And my sincere hope is that sparks curiosity. If someone sees a person in the card deck that they either recognize and want to learn more about, or don't recognize and want to learn more about, that the flavor text gives them some information about where to go look and why I decided to include that card in the game. Lots of bits and bobs for this game, lots of dice. There's custom dice, and there's even dice that makes the game more difficult if you're playing cooperatively against what we call the Autobot, where there's dice that don't have any ones on it, so that their opposition is more difficult. The campaigners are all custom. There's these ladies wearing their dress, and then some gentlemen in their top hats, one with an angry fist. We use buttons to create a currency in the game. Those buttons are based on on historical designs. The suffrage movement was the first political movement to use campaign buttons that let their supporters wear their allegiance on their lapel, and so using the button design was really important to me. It was an important piece of political history, and giving credit to the suffragists for that development that just seems so normal, and not even like it's hard to believe that there was ever even a time before there were buttons, but of course there was, and it was before the suffrage movement. The supply of cubes that I mentioned, that's how it's our sort of territorial area control metric. The opposition is this straight orange color. The suffrage uses both purple and yellow. The purple and yellow are traditional colors of the American women's suffrage movement. And in the game, they provide some important design elements that show divisions in the movement, that show that the movement was not a monolith, and that the opposition is able to exploit these designs and these divides. So, when players first sit down at the table, they often ask me, what's the difference between purple and yellow? Like, well, it's probably more than you might think, but you got to play the game to find out. My suggestion is always to try to stay balanced, to balance your bits, and that having purple and yellow in any given state creates some checks and balances on the opposition wiping you out. And the last piece is part of the final voting measures that I briefly mentioned. The sort of second act of the game, once Congress has passed the amendment, if Congress passes it by the end of the sixth turn, we start replacing cubes with checks and X's. And this, in effect, is the act of a state legislature voting to reject or to ratify the amendment. And once those votes happen, they are permanent. They are here to stay. And we track progress towards those 36 states needed to ratify or 13 states needed to reject by counting out these red X's and green checks. It's very satisfying to put a bunch of green checks on a board and to have all of those state houses vote in support of women's rights. And I suppose when you're playing opposition, it's very satisfying to say, no, not them. Not today, not on my watch. And so it creates a board motif that's really a striking visual. To win, as I've mentioned, you need to get that support in Congress. We use 6 columns in the game. The Constitution says 2/3 of House, but that's just way too many cubes, or way too many columns. So we simplified that with 6 columns, and then this 3/4 of state legislatures, that stays the same. And opposition only needs to prevent the congressional approval, congressional support, and if they fail to do that, then majority support in 13 states. these are a few of the like prototype designs as like things got more complicated and then less complicated and then kind of back to more complicated. I'm always curious to see different prototypes and how people are thinking about it. So I thought maybe you two would like to see, nothing comes out fully formed. Everything is sort of a work in process. I was not done with my design. It was just due. And so that's where we ended up and what we ended up with. But as you can see, right, as we were sending out different playtests and looking at different board designs, this is sort of the iterative process that we went through. And you can see this center one. This is part of the playtest kit. We did 100 playtests sent out to folks who had been playtesters on Shores of Tripoli that Kevin had met through his game, folks with subject matter expertise, a bunch of my friends that don't play board games at all to see how they would react to something like this kind of complexity. And so it was a real wide-ranging group of folks that engaged in the playtesting process. And we used Google, like a Google form to break down the multiple plays and who won, how long did it take, did this happen, did something come out, like lots of questions to ask the folks that then used, frankly, to like help balance the game when we were going through prototypes and in the playtest. I think that deck had about suffrage winning 60%, and we pushed it down to 55 by ramping up some of the opposition cards, because everybody wants to have a shot at playing it, and nobody wants to play a game where the outcome is predetermined. At least I don't want to play a game where the outcome is predetermined. So this is what it looks like as you're starting to put all of these cubes out, as you're putting your meeples into your campaigners into different areas of the board. There are we have these sort of strategy and state cards that help move people across the board and give one-time effects. You see a couple of the strategy cards up at the top of the gameplay. And this is really the meat and potatoes of the game, this work that's happening to what I would think of as sort of like building public support out in the states where people live, convincing folks to think differently about women and their role in our society, and that the fact that they're doing a lot of important work in our society also means that they have important work to do in government and should have a say in who represents us. This is, as I like to talk about, this is the state of play in August of 1920, when it was all sort of coming down to the wire. There was a wave of supportive states that voted immediately for the suffrage amendment starting in 1919 after Congress had passed. There was a few state houses that immediately voted against. But what we see here is a 35-8 board with states like Florida, Connecticut, and Vermont still left, and North Carolina still left to vote. An important note on North Carolina, when suffrage legislation was first introduced in North Carolina, it was in the late 1800s, and it was for women to vote in local elections. That piece of legislation was introduced in the State House and immediately referred to the committee that had jurisdiction over insane asylums. Because even in the late 1800s, trolls gonna troll, right? So North Carolina was not likely. It was not really felt like there was a real shot for victory. Florida, Vermont, and Connecticut were also very difficult. I live in Baltimore. Maryland had already voted against it. So there was really not a lot of options left for suffrage. It was not entirely clear that they were going to win in Tennessee either. But fortunately, they did, and the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution a few days later by Colby Bainbridge, the Secretary of State at the time. The game also includes this stack of reproductions. My publisher included a letter from Thomas Jefferson in Shores of Tripoli that he published, and really liked the idea of like a historical artifact or two. So he asked for like 3 options of what I might want to add into the game. I gave him 15 documents, and we compromised for 13. None of these documents are necessary for gameplay. A lot of them are referenced in one way or another in gameplay. But as you open the box and start to immerse yourself in these decks and in the design and in the experience, these documents create this flood of tangible history. And it's been something that folks talk a lot about when they review the game, folks that mention it when they talk about playing the game, that as an immersive experience of playing through history, these documents are doing work. Even if they are not, you don't have to trade your specimen ballot for your voter registration card. And it's just something that I'm really proud of. I'm really glad that Kevin and Fort Circle put the time to do a bunch of different papers and different paper weights, because I think it really does bring home this experience. Talk very briefly, and I want to move on to questions pretty quickly. So just right, like as promised in the topic, the subject of this lecture, what does playing Votes for Women do to help us understand the present? So I have a lot of them. I maybe went a little too crazy, but for folks who access this later, you should have also have access to the slideshow. Um, you know, movements are built around a great idea whose time has come or will come. And this idea really drives so much of the movement, of the suffrage movement. And it's this idea that like women's voices matter, that women are an important piece of our society and deserve representation. Um, you know, it gets marketed in lots of different ways, right? Some of it is women are so good at cleaning. We could clean up politics, right? Like they are not the most necessarily gender equitable, advanced, right? Like how we would talk about things today, but they are arguments that push the kinds of people they needed to vote the way they needed them to. I also hope people understand that movements start small, right? Like everything starts somewhere. And there's just this like one gathering in upstate New York that is like an inflection point in creating a spark. And other sparks get lit on their own. And that's what's necessary because the status quo is such a powerful barrier to change. The suffrage movement was not just a movement of people that thought women should vote. There were a lot of people who came to suffrage because they thought that alcohol was ruining families and endangering women's lives. And the temperance movement saw suffrage as a way to achieve their goals and to protect women and families from the scourge of alcoholism. There were a lot of union workers who saw the way that factory owners were able to divide men and women, pitting them against each other. And if that they had an equal say in the political process, they would have an equal say at work. So unions came to suffrage. It was not just about voting. Voting became a means to an end. And lots of people had different values, goals, and visions about the kind of society that they wanted. And they saw that suffrage was a way to achieve those disparate goals. This monolith, right? This like not being a monolith, having these different complicated factors of having these different ideas can strengthen or destroy a movement. It is normal for movements to have disagreements. The question is, how are those managed and how are they pushed past? Movements face hard choices, limited resources, and you must roll the dice. You have to take a shot in movements. And that's an incredibly important lesson, I think, as folks think about what's happening in society. Movements spawn backlash, sometimes furious backlash. The suffrage, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, which is the same year that the Miss America pageant was started, right? As women were expanding their role, expanding what they were doing in society, expanding the notions of femininity and womanhood, a large part of our society was taking a very big claw back onto what they thought women should do and how they should do it, right? It is not chance that those two things coincided. And anyone in a movement should expect backlash. And Susan Faludi's her theory is that backlash isn't even a response to progress, but the like appearance that progress might be possible, right? If you're curious why backlash is happening, look at how much progress has been made and how much people have to protect when they are sort of wrapping themselves around their own privilege and rights. And the last I think players should realize is that movements are built like players like them, that there are a lot of names that we never know. There's a lot of people who did incredibly hard work who didn't make it into State Historical Society documents, definitely didn't make it into my game. It's thousands and millions of people doing good, important work at a very small level. And whether that is just talking to someone they know, making copies, or standing on a soapbox with a tote bag in the public square, yelling about progress. It's people like us, not necessarily the Susan B. Anthony's and the Alice Pauls. It's all of us. This, like, you might sort of have gleaned from some of my presentation. Race and gender has mattered in America. It always has. I A lot of the original documents, the primary sources, the speeches given in the wells of the Senate are about racial domination and white supremacy. Those are not terms made up by activists. Those are terms that were used commonly by the folks who were opposed to progress. You know, that we had to, so those debates, those changes, right? Like, it's all a part of it. And that the suffrage movement took 70 years because it also took 70 years to change ideas about gender and about roles in society. And they had to happen together. One couldn't have happened without the other. So, the fights that we're fighting may feel like, oh, are we ever going to stop fighting them? I don't know, probably not, because we haven't, right? America's entire history has been fought on these fault lines. So last, what I learned, progress is hard, progress is slow, progress is not inevitable. There are a lot of timelines where the 19th Amendment doesn't pass in 1920 and they have to go back to the state by state strategy. And sometimes progress isn't even progress when we think about how does it extend to everyone it needs to extend to. But ultimately, I did not learn this from Votes for Women, but I was reminded that progress is worth fighting for, sacrificing for, devoting your life for. You know, things can be better, and things are really tough for people in America. We have huge gaps of inequality. We have people really struggling to access food, clean water, medical care, and it doesn't need to be that way. We can do better, and I am motivated by folks who are living those struggles, and as just as much as I am inspired by folks who are working to bridge the gaps. So that's a little bit of what I learned. So, whew, in summary, there's a lot that went into Votes for Women, and I've been really heartened by the positive comments. The reviews have been really strong, really nice things. This is my first game design. I did not know what to expect. It's been wonderful to go to conventions, to come to classrooms, to talk about why I designed Votes for Women and what I hope people will get out of it. I love hearing that it's fun, because if it wasn't fun, nobody will ever pay attention to anything and the rest of it. It will all be for naught, but the fact that people want to play it and like playing it has been really wonderful. Been able to talk with folks like you. It's been taught in high school classrooms, in government, in college classrooms, folks that are interested in game design. It's been a nice sort of entry point into folks' experience with war games and with more complicated, complex games, because they are attracted by a unique theme. It's been translated now into Spanish, and I am just over the moon that people outside of America are very interested in playing the game, whether because of its design or because of its theme or because of both. But the fact that folks in countries around the world have been playing Votes for Women has just been an extraordinary privilege, and it's been very exciting. There's been some controversy. Some people are very mad, but that is what it is. I think, I think it would be a lot worse if it was just ignored outright. 3,000 games are published a year, and a lot of those games, find a very small core of very rabid players. My game has reached a lot of folks, in part because Facebook banned our ads and it created this sort of mini virality. I would rather have um, I would rather have a few naysayers than no one saying anything at all. If you are in the Washington, D.C. area and you are interested, you can buy Votes for Women at Labyrinth, which is the best game store in D.C., maybe the best game store in the country. Go to Eastern Market, go say hi to Kathleen, the owner of Labyrinth. She helped playtest the game and is just like a wonderful person who is building community in a way that I am very jealous of. She's so good at it and natural at it. You can also play for free online at Rally the Troops. and we can drop the link into the chat since this is a lot. Or you can just search "Rally the Troops." It's really a great way to sort of the rules all just happen for you, which is nice. And so with that, I will say thank you very much and open it up for questions. I see some chat bubbles. So hopefully we got a couple of questions in.
Hey, thanks, Tory. We have lots of questions. I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague Morgan, who's going to do her first webinar and lead your Q&A section. So Morgan, you want to come off mute and read the first question for us?
Yes, absolutely. So the first question is, despite the very different subject matter, the vibe reminds me of the GMT coin games like Fire in the Lake. Did you draw any inspiration from these?
I did not. I find coin games to be a little complicated. I have a Jest of Robin Hood. It's got like two rule books. There's like a rule book and a playbook. That is like it is on my list to go after. I mean, those games have been incredibly popular, and I think games of like Progress of the People have been important additions to the GMT library, but it wasn't a part of my design inspiration, although the vibes are immaculate on a lot of those games, and I'm into it.
All right, so the next one, they mentioned that it's a two-part question. So I'll start with the first one and let you answer and then move on to the second.
Okay.
Um, so it says, in our dozen or so playthroughs, we've found that the opposition has a win rate of about 70%. Is this meant to reflect the challenges of the suffragettes, or are we doing something wrong? We've noticed a significant dynamic of late game swings when the suffragettes win.
I think it is that I'm surprised to hear 70%. I think first time players, I often opposition has an advantage, and that is in somewhat of a design intent because the status quo is powerful and it is difficult to overcome the status quo. And I think the what I've seen is that the more you play and the more you get familiar with particularly the suffrage deck, the more likely you are to be able to marshal your forces. Yes, I think that the swings for suffrage in the late game are by design. The suffrage movement became more powerful in the last 10 years. So the deck does the same thing. What you can do at the beginning with your Seneca Falls card and some of those right cards in the first era are pretty small, right? It's in a few cubes, a few field support in a few regions, and by the time you get to the late era deck, you're putting 10 cubes into regions, right? Like, and so that's by design, right? And a part of the asymmetry of the victory conditions and a part of the asymmetry of how suffrage built power exponentially over time. And I would have some questions about that 70%. My first question would be how often and when is Southern strategy being played? And we would have a conversation about Southern strategy and the effect it has on the game, the possibilities it gives to opposition, and what that means in the late era.
All right, so the second part of the question says, given the continuity of the underlying amending process and the current calls by many for an amendment guaranteeing reproductive rights, have you thought of modifying the engine to build a forward-looking game oriented on obtaining such an amendment or an analogous victory for women or BIPOC plus folk?
Hmm. I have not. I've had a lot of questions about would I what about the Equal Rights Amendment, right? An existing amendment that is out there, and like, could you design a strategy, right, as the player that would sort of beat the ticking clock? Because in essence, the organizers for the ERA did not beat the ticking clock. I think that I would love to play test someone's forward-looking design on expansion. I think that like, would you build in the current makeup of state houses, right? Like, and I don't know, Republicans hold a majority of state houses. You need a majority of state houses, three quarters majority of state houses to pass this. How, like, what is the play that acknowledges the current makeup of our state legislatures that then creates interesting conflict and a potential to win in the game. But like, you do that, I will play, and when it's published, I will tell everyone to play it because I think it sounds fascinating.
Okay, next question asks, what points in history would you like to see future tabletop war games cover?
Mm. I have been kicking around this idea, and it's been I think that the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency is a really interesting story. It's another Nixon game, which like God, like between Watergate and 1960, like how many board games does Richard Nixon need? But the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency as the result of lots of negotiations, to me, I think there's an interesting game, a semi-cooperative game. And if you had a chance to play Alex Knight's Land and Freedom, it's a semi-cooperative game about the Spanish Civil War and the sort of the status quo, democracy forces, the socialists, the anarchists, right? They're all fighting against the fascists in the Civil War. And essentially, like, no one player can do too well, or you upset the balance and the fascists win. And so you have to contain and right like and work together in order as players in order to work together to defeat the fascists. And I think that there's an interesting semi-cooperative game of like how environmental agent organizations were working together while competing with each other for some of these important wins on environmental protection in the late 60s, early 70s. And so that I think is just like there's just like a really interesting story. And I think semi-cooperative is like a really interesting design tool. I have been thinking about different pieces of our labor history in different places where women's organizing has made workplace organizing possible. Even workplaces where women weren't the majority, their efforts have been incredibly important in creating safer working conditions, in getting children out of factories, out of some of the really basics, out of supporting the things like coal strikes. And so that's I think where I've been like noodling the most is sort of on women's work and what its evolving function, its role in labor organizing, and in sort of where we are today would really matter. So those are also some like historical moments. I mean, I think that the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and some of the organizing that's happening there, like it just like the story that comes through is one of these just like often destitute indigent women that are working for pennies a day, that are willing to tell their boss to stuff it because someone they knew got fired and it was unfair. Oh, I just think it's like it's pretty rad and would make for an interesting clash, right? Especially if you're playing women versus bosses or women versus, right, that there would be some kind of power conflict that would be really interesting.
All right, next question is, what would you do differently in the initial research part of the game design if you were to start this project again from scratch?
Hmm. I don't know how to. I didn't know what I didn't know, and so now that I know what I know, what would I know? I think that like start with Wikipedia is like is good advice. Um, I think that I probably would have gone through more books, although it was hard at the time. Like library lending was restricted in 2020, and so it took a little while for my library to set up a like I don't know a COVID safe way to get books from the library. I think I went ham and had all of these things. I think I would have been a little bit more thinking through categories. So in each piece of the deck, there is a book, and a book has this sort of one design function. And so when you pull the card that has the book on it, it does this kind of thing. I think I would have thought more about the sort of event text categories, that Sojourner Truth does in the Midwestern region, what Frederick Douglass does in the Northeastern region, which not Jeanette Rankin, she does special things, but right, like you see these sort of categories and identities that, like, if I had had a little bit more of a design vocabulary when I started researching, I would have been looking for specific things. I had to go back and do a lot of stuff. I had to do pretty much all of that Senate research on opposition, because I just didn't have enough cards to fill out the Senate deck, and I needed more to fill out the congressional progress column. And so there was stuff I had to go back to, and I think that, like, so much of the design was led by research. I think having now had the benefit of the design, it would have made research a lot easier. There wouldn't have been 150 freaking categories. It would have been like, oh, I probably need a book for this, or right, like I want this draw to play one, and that should be right, like this kind of category, this kind of event, this kind of person, would have been a lot easier.
All right. Next one says, what was the most surprising thing you learned in researching the opposition?
No. I think just how there was an organized opposition to suffrage and how it was led by women. My history classes did not talk about that. It was just sort of this notion of, like, crusty old white dudes that didn't want to give up any of their privilege, and there were, but you know Josephine Dodge was an incredibly effective organizer. She was sort of the Phyllis Schlafly, Ann Coulter, Candace Owens of her time, right? Like, this is terrible. Women don't need this. This is right. Like, this is low morals and low cut dresses and don't right. So that I thought was interesting. I also found other women who, like Emma Goldman, right? That opposed suffrage from the left, right? That, like, what we need is a revolution in this country, and voting is a waste of time. So why would we bother trying to get the vote when really what we need to do is burn it down, right? And so it was really important to me as a bit of a leftist to include that, like, the range of women's of voices in opposition to suffrage, because so much of it is like, well, liquor distributors didn't want temperance, and so they fund it, right? Like these sort of like vague, shadowy forces against progress are in fact real people who had real motivations. And I tried to deal with their opposition as respectfully and honestly as I could, because it does us no good to pretend that opposition now is some kind of shadowy force, right? Like, they have motivation, they have operation, they have important, just because I disagree doesn't mean that it isn't, like, a part of our history and about the debate now. And so yeah, I think, there's almost all of it was surprising, given how little I knew about opposition to suffrage in the first place.
All right, next one is, how did you narrow down all of the information that would eventually become the cards? I'm especially interested in the process for the opposition deck.
So in suffrage, there was, like, all of these sort of questions, or all of these possibilities that were, like, whittled down. For opposition, it was in fact, a lot of this isn't going to work. I need to go back to the source material and find, right? So the congressional columns was an aspect of the design that sort of came in late. Like, how do we go from all of these states you're building support to now they're voting, right? Like, what gets you to final voting? And this congressional track became a part of it. And so I had to go back and pull those Senate archive transcripts to find Senator Cottonwood, Ed Wood Smith, right? Like, to find these senators that were constantly berating suffrage and saying that they didn't think suffrage should happen because it'll just let Black women vote. So there was a lot of, I think there was, like, maybe the 1930 teen earthquake in San Francisco was also a piece of like, I need something here. And so like what was happening at the time, and like, all right, well, these natural disasters, put a crimp in our organizing style, right? And so the research for opposition, or it was more about sort of building bulk up rather than whittling down for opposition, which is why you probably see so many senators that say, take one column out of Congress and put 2 cubes in their home state, is because it was trying to balance out that Congress metric, and so had to go in and find that content to make that feasible and make that part of the game workable.
All right. During your presentation, you mentioned that you weren't done with the board design, that it was just due. What would you have added or changed about the version that was published?
I think it's the game in general. I think I talked about it while we were looking at the versions of the board designs. I mean, there are a whole lot of things I've learned that like I could have, instead of that card, I could have done this, right? I could have I don't want to take out any cards, but like the role that the bicycle plays in shaping American culture, especially during this time of the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? Like women used to have to be escorted from their home to wherever it was they were going, right? The bicycle let women move quickly through their neighborhoods, through the streets to where they were going, giving them independence and freedom of movement to then go to an organizing meeting, to a rally, to places that maybe a man in their home wouldn't have let them go to or approved of there, and would not have escorted them to. I really, I should, I would, I should have put a bike cart in, right? Like, and as like I said, sort of keep reading and learning, right? Like all of these things, it's a 70 years of American history about the role that women play and will play and could play. It is as diverse as history itself, right? The way that women are engaged in wartime, a big turning point in the game is the role that women are playing as volunteers, as ambulance drivers, as like serving on in lines in Europe in 1917 and 1918. Did I do enough service for that, and how important that was? I don't know. Like it's just all of these really tough choices. And so I probably would have hemmed and hawed forever. Oh, this one in, no, no, none of that one in, no, no, this one in, right? And so at a certain point, you just got to move it along. So I will also just move it along in this question.
All right, next one says, what did you use to make the map on the game board? Was it drawing freehand, Adobe Illustrator, etc.?
Kevin, my publisher, had a map, and then we worked with illustrators, designers to create the map designs. And so I I know that the Susan B. Anthony, there's one with like oh here, let's I have the tools, the powers and technologies. So this was the very first design. I don't know. I'm pretty sure Bridget Delicato did the version with the like imagery, the 2 women and the Supreme Court, or the Capitol at the bottom. Um, I don't know how they did it, but it's really helpful to work with very talented people with that kind of technical experience, that they could just like hand me a map, and I was grateful for it.
All right, next question is, can you share any new or interesting games that you've been playing for someone, or sorry, that you've been playing that someone in Canada might not necessarily be exposed to? The person asking the question is from Canada.
From Canada. But I think like next on my list is a Jest of Robin Hood. I think that it's gotten a lot of like really lovely buzz, and is supposed to be an approachable coin game, which I am into approachable games. I think a game that came out at the same time that mine did is Stonewall Uprising, about the gay rights movement. We come at these issues from at similar places, right? Like sympathetic and a part of this effort. But Taylor Schuss, instead of right having all of these people that are the opposition, he uses a sort of monolith, the man, and you are working through 60s, 70s, and 80s organizing around gay rights. And so I've been lucky to appear on a bunch of panels and right to get to talk and compare and contrast about our games. And so that I think would also, if you're interested in this kind of like movement history, pieces of American history, I think that that's a great place to look to go. And of course, Talia Rosen's forthcoming first Monday in October about the history of the American Supreme Court. I'm got to do like a early well, she's been working on that game forever, but like a previous prototype. I think they've got all of their files back there on final, right? It's done and due, and I can't wait to get my copy that I kickstarted. And I think everybody should play first Monday in October.
All right, final question is, do you have any advice for students designing games in class?
I think be curious, I think is like super great advice. For me, the way that I dove into this, and something that I care about, like I work at I work at a teachers union now, and so like I care a lot about public schools, and it drives me to do good work at work. I care about movements and about women's rights, and it drove me to do work on this game. Maybe I'm just kind of lazy, but like I have found that things I care about and am passionate about are the things that I spend the time on. And so, to like be curious about what you care about. And, there's been, I think, an interesting conversation among publishers about these kind of message games, which I find a little like whatever, like that's how you want to call it, sure. But I think that there is a player appetite for well-designed, interesting games that aren't the same six battles that games have been designed on, and that if there's something that you are interested in, and it doesn't even have to be politics or like right like this kind of movement stuff, like work work on what interests you, what keep you engaged, because my sense is that like it comes out in the product, in the deliverable, in the game. It comes out when you care. It came out that I cared deeply about this stuff, and I would suggest that might be a place to mine for interesting themes, for what this game has given me a platform to talk to people that I would have never had a chance to talk to. And I'm really glad it's about this and not about like zombies or pirate zombies, right? Like those are fun games. People love those games. They sell at Target. They're very people who make those games are very successful, right? Like what would I have to say to you about pirate zombies? But instead, I get to talk to you about being involved in things you care about, and about how the only way we're going to make a difference and make this country better is by doing it together. And that's been really important for me.
Okay, I lied. It looks like there is one more question in the chat.
Oh, Morgan.
Can you recommend any science games?
Oh. Uh, I don't know if this is on topic, but I really like Holotype, which is a game about digging up dinosaur bones, and mostly it is about publishing your findings as a paleontologist. So it's a worker placement game. There's a professor, a grad student, and an assistant, and you go from the lab, the library, the publishers to the dig sites, and you are trying to collect specimens and create full sets of dinosaur bones, and that then you are publishing these new works. And there's a cooperative piece as well on one of your sort of like tracker boards, but mostly you are just trying to find rad dinosaurs. And I think that paleontology counts as science. Right. Right, Morgan?
I concur. Those are all the questions. Sebastian, if you want to wrap up.
So Both of you did your first Goose webinar, so congrats to both of you. I want to thank our crowd and our YouTube audience in the future for enjoying this awesome talk, and I learned a lot. Thank you. And hopefully you'll be back for our future webinars, and you find find other videos on YouTube. And on behalf of Georgetown, Tory, I want to thank you for your time, your expertise, and your generosity to sit with us and talk about your awesome game.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and congratulations on Total Commander. Like, your work has been amazing. You are a design machine, and I am very jealous of that.
I obviously paid Tory ahead of time to say that. But thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.